Thank you, Vanessa. Lovely to see so many of you here in the room, and welcome to everybody online as well. It's really great to be here. When I designed this series of 3 talks, the aim was to try and reposition the work in the Urban Institute on co-production within this broader field of urban epistemics. But as I was exploring this a little bit more, I realised we don't really know what urban epistemics is. So it's rather grand to say, let's talk about the future when we haven't necessarily got a good sense of the present. So in that first lecture, which was called Why Should Urbanists Care About Co-Production? Come in. I argued that co-production can be seen as a response to the need for new epistemologies of the urban and as a corrective to epistemic injustice. We then had Kavita's lecture, as Vanessa said, which really connected with some of these broader debates around the politics of data and knowledge production, circulation and regulation that shape everyday life. And I think, speaking from outside urban studies, Kavita's lecture left us so much to think about, like how digital piracy is a kind of revenge for years of underdevelopment, how localized piracy is sometimes valued as being really creative or sometimes just dismissed as a form of non-creative copying, and how some of the current debates on knowledge capitalism and the enclosure of the commons find antecedents in colonial trading of scientific objects and assets. So what I want to do today is just sketch out what this field of urban epistemics might look like. It's a bit of a grand tour, it's quite broad, it's quite exploratory. It's definitely an invitation for us to start this conversation and discussion together. The field of urban epistemics hasn't really been coherently framed, so I think there's a really interesting and exciting opportunity for some new work. So I found it useful to put this together. I hope you do too. I'm going to cover 3 kinds of areas in this introductory talk. So first, I'm going to look at some of the epistemic debates and influences that we can draw upon to delineate the field. Then in the second part, I'll look at some of the explicit urban dimensions of these debates and what work within urban studies is already going on that we can start to engage with. And third, then, I'm going to tentatively set out what an agenda for urban epistemics might look like as a sort of launch pad for thematic renewal at the Urban Institute. And before I do, just a word about some of the images you're going to see in the presentation. You've probably seen in the news there's a lot of hype around artificial intelligence art at the moment. And so I fed some keywords into an AI app called Dream around urban epistemics and the commodification of expertise, just to see what it would throw up, and generated this set of trading cards that you're going to see. And I think what these artificially generated images do as we move through the presentation is kind of trace this story about what knowledge matters to how and by whom it's generated in the first place. So this is what I'm going to take us through. These are the different kinds of debates and influences that provide some building blocks to frame the field of urban epistemics. I'm going to move through them today rather rapidly, and I'm afraid in no way will I do them justice. I will say I'm doing that on purpose to leave lots of openings for you to come into the discussion and share your own ideas. I'm also going to say the word epistemic a lot, and this is why I'll conclude part 1 with a reflection on the different epistemic vocabularies that we can take from this interdisciplinary tour in order to understand some critical issues within urban studies. So I'm going to start with the idea of epistemological exclusion, and I want to talk about 3 different kinds of epistemological exclusions. First, there's the kind of way that scholars have always been excluded from the canon in different disciplines, according, for instance, to race, gender, sex, class, ability, or geography. So one example is the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, who has been excluded from the canon of sociological work as a result of what Ryland Rabacher calls intellectual amnesia or epistemic apartheid, which involves the kind of replication of social inequalities within society, within academia itself. In Patricia Hill Collins' work on Black feminist thought, she develops a framework for subjugated knowledges, or knowledges that are kept out of dominant epistemic systems. And the focus then is on how knowledge can be used as a gatekeeping practice to maintain power within a racialized system. These themes resonate with ideas around epistemic violence, obedience and disobedience, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, set forth by scholars like Spivak, Mignolo, dos Santos and Escobar. And here, exclusions are geographical, in which knowledges are excluded according to where in the world they may have been produced and by whom, shaped by colonial logics and hegemonic ideologies. And for Uda, they write that these processes have thrown knowledge systems into deep epistemic imbalance and given rise to the epistemic decolonial turn. So a second kind of epistemological exclusion relates to the exclusion of those sometimes referred to as non-academics, which I think is rather derogatory, from knowledge production, raising questions of whose knowledge matters and how and with whom we do our work. Epistemology has been challenged to take account of both the partiality of our own knowledge claims and legitimise those of others. And that's reflected in a lot of debates, for instance, around standpoint epistemology or post-nominal science, for instance, where knowledge produced under conditions of uncertainty and complexity can be validated within extended peer communities. There are a lot of different methods and approaches that then arise in response to these different sorts of exclusions, which challenge how we epistemologically position ourselves and others, and the kinds of epistemic choreography we undertake. I had thought I'd made the word epistemic choreography up, but I found it inevitably written by someone else. So I will make sure that I share the correct reference in due course. So this idea of epistemic choreography is about how knowledge needs to be negotiated in order to counter what Lorraine Code calls the excesses of demonstrably unjust social, political, epistemic orders. So participatory methods like co-production are sometimes part of the solution, valuing epistemic diversity and pluralism, but may also retain or reinforce academia's epistemic privilege. And the third, just see if I can get rid of that. Oh, I just realised, there you go. The third kind of epistemological exclusion concerns the critique from applied philosophers that epistemology hasn't been sufficiently concerned with practices of epistemic agents, communities, and epistemic problems. And so this kind of epistemic turn demands that we pay more attention to practical questions about what we should believe and how we, individually and collectively, should pursue knowledge, wisdom, and other epistemic values. So a key example of this epistemic turn or applied turn in philosophy is the notion of epistemic injustice. And Miranda Fricke's work is best known here, which I referred to in the last talk as well. She was one of the first in philosophy to coherently name and frame the concept, though, of course, as always the case, there are many antecedents. And her aim was really to focus on the kind of entanglements of reason with social power. So she argued that we needed socially situated accounts to deal with these interdependencies between power, reason, and epistemic authority. The main focus here is about the ways in which social power operates in epistemic interactions. So last time I used the ideas that she gives us around testimonial injustice, which is the extent to which we give credibility to someone's word, or hermeneutical injustice, which is the extent to which there are concepts to describe and validate people's experience. And I think this work's really important in framing urban epistemics because it highlights the relationships between social and epistemic injustice, the way in which epistemic trust connects to social power, or how social disadvantage can produce unjust epistemic disadvantage. And the danger that Miranda Fricke highlights is that of epistemic objectification, which really cuts to the core of what it means to be human, what it means to know. In one of the articles I was reading, they were talking about Homo sapiens as obviously being the knowing person, the knowing being. And our wisdom and knowledge are part of our defining features as humans, as illustrated in this quote from Fricke's work. This idea of epistemic injustice has been really widely used, but not necessarily within urban studies, as I'll come to later. For instance, by Nancy Tuana in relation to feminism, Louvel Anderson in their work on the pursuit of post-racial ideals, by Hall on queer epistemology, and McKinnon on gaslighting in relation to trans experiences. I think whilst Fricke's work is often cited, Christy Dotson's work's also really useful on epistemic oppression. She builds on Fricke's two kinds of epistemic justice, but she identifies a third, which is what she calls third order epistemic oppression. And that's when the epistemic system as a whole is inadequate. So here, addressing testimonial or hermeneutic injustice is insufficient, and it won't work because the economic resilience of the system prevents other kinds of ideas or patterns of thought from altering it. So individuals' testimonies are rejected, and because partly accepting them would constitute what she calls an epistemic revolution. And I think this is really important because where Fricker sees the solution to epistemic injustice as being about the individual cultivation of epistemic virtue, and by that she means things like giving credibility to someone's word, or being more open-minded, or being more sensitive to different kinds of evidence, Dotson's work engages much more with systemic issues and the way in which epistemic power works. So how people and institutions influence what comes to be regarded as legitimate knowledge and who qualifies as being authoritative in the first place. Okay, so over to ignorance. Beyond Fricker's work, I think there are a couple of other ideas that really help us think about epistemic injustice and then this field of urban epistemics, which come to attention through thinking about the field of ignorance studies. When I started doing this work, I didn't know there was a field of ignorance studies, but it's a field that's developed greatly in the last 20 years, in part in response to this kind of paradox that the more we know, the less we know. So ignorance is seen here as a defining feature of contemporary life, and that means positioning knowledge not in relation to the search for certainty, but grappling with uncertainty. And I'm thinking here of some of Sheila Jasanoff's work on the technologies of humility, which policymakers need in order to systematically assess the unknown and the uncertain. Or then there's Vanessa and Malik's recent paper on radical unknowability as well. Michael Smithson, in 1989, he proposed that ignorance is not simply the absence of knowledge, but is socially constructed according to different types. And where I think this intersects with, is that me, Vicky?
I think somebody at home.
Yeah. Would you mind muting if you're online? Where this intersects with discussions on epistemic justice is when ignorance is this kind of willful decision not to know, not to see, not to find out. So Fricker's work is sometimes about being blameless in the kinds of epistemic injustices that we cause. But this kind of willful ignorance is actively produced and mobilised. There's a really interesting edited handbook of ignorance studies by Matthias Gross and Lindsay McGooey, and they highlight how ignorance can be strategically or culturally produced by states or big governments. You know, the example of tobacco is given as a tool of secrecy or dissimulation. But it doesn't always have to serve the interests of the powerful. So, for instance, ignorance or the fact that we don't know, that we're open-minded, underpins some of the ideals of experimentation and surprise in ecological design. Ignorance can be seen sometimes as similar to having an open mind. Feigned ignorance can be a tool of dissimulation, for instance, to resist demands for knowledge disclosure, like being asked to disclose your sexual orientation or something. And there are two particular kinds of ignorance that are explicitly linked to epistemic injustice. The first is what Charles W. Mill calls white ignorance in his 1997 book, which isn't the kind of epistemological exclusion I was talking about earlier, but rather it's a kind of active misinterpretation of the world, a form of non-knowing in which white racial domination plays a crucial causal role. And the second is willful hermeneutical ignorance. And so this is where concepts might exist to make sense of the experiences of marginalised or oppressed groups, but they are ignored or disparaged. So this idea is from Gail Polhouse, and it's about sort of where the privileged decide not to try and understand novel concepts or go beyond the surface level. And I think that's really interesting, this kind of willful hermeneutical ignorance, because Fricker's idea of hermeneutical injustice suggests that these concepts don't exist to make sense of people's experiences. Whereas what Polhouse gives us is the idea that marginalised groups do have their own understandings and expressions, but these are silenced through forms of ethically blameworthy ignorance by those with epistemic privilege. And the danger of these kinds of epistemic injustices is actually in the death of particular kinds of knowledge systems over time. So, responding to Dotson's insistence to think about the system, some scholars are focused on epistemic governance. And so this is more about the way that governance functions by working on people's conceptions of social reality. And it pushes hermeneutical injustice that much further. So here it's not just that concepts are lacking to explain individuals' realities, but that particular and usually very familiar imageries are what constitutes the entire system of epistemic governance. And those imageries stem from entrenched ways of seeing and knowing the world, and those are produced and perpetuated through our epistemic interactions. So I want to draw here on a book by Jose Medina on the epistemology of resistance. In this book, he widens the idea of epistemic injustice to include these kinds of systemic features: unequal access to and participation in knowledge practices. So for him, epistemic justice is not positioned as an answer to the blindness of philosophy, but an answer to the democratic deficits, or to the deficits of democracy. So Medina positions epistemic injustice as a question for democracy by focusing on what epistemic justice would look like in institutions, not as a virtue of individuals. And that means for him paying attention to the kind of democratic practices, the importance of dissent, for instance, as being epistemically productive, epistemic diversity, and this thing he calls epistemic friction. So he argues that epistemic friction is fundamental for a healthy democracy. That also requires epistemic responsibility and resistance. And he sort of says it's our duty to resist these forms of epistemic oppression in pursuit of epistemic justice. Even I feel I've said the word epistemic too many times now already. One of the key things here is that different individuals have different kinds of responsibilities depending on where they're positioned in the system. And I think this is interesting because it's indicative of a much wider, what's called the epistemic turn in deliberative democracy. Okay, so the fifth kind of debate I think we need to engage with as we think about the field of urban epistemics is around sort of learning and critical education. And I think much of the previous debates that I've sketched out, albeit very briefly, have quite a static feel about them. You know, knowledge is something one has, and whether that is recognised or validated depends on a whole range of factors. But the field of urban epistemics also needs to take account of some of these critical debates around learning and pedagogy, as well as paying attention to individual virtues and vices and epistemic systems and orders. We need to think about whether and how learning and pedagogy might constitute what I'm going to tentatively call a reparative epistemic logic. And so there's some really interesting work in critical education here to draw upon that finds its expression in contemporary work on lifelong learning, communities of practice, or social learning systems. There's work, for instance, to encourage teachers and educators in education studies to cultivate epistemic disobedience in the way in which they teach curriculum within the classroom. That's obviously reflected in our own nascent and, of course, still insufficient efforts to decolonise our own curriculum. And in a community context, there's a danger, though, of course, that this kind of idea of pedagogy can reinforce a binary between the teacher and the taught, in which a lack of knowledge on the part of the learner is corrected by the provision of knowledge by some sort of educated other. And I think we can sort of go back to some of Paulo Freire's work to challenge that kind of binary, because he was emphasising not the transfer of knowledge from an expert to a non-knower, but a process of learning as self-emergence through consciousness raising or conscientisation. And I think there's also, linking back to the first lecture I gave, a connection here with some of Luc Boltanski's work on pragmatic sociology. And so if anyone was there in the first lecture, I was sort of talking about his work to help us think through the ways in which critical competencies exist already within people, within their everyday lives. So it's not about learning how to think critically about one's condition. And I think that sort of connects to some of the contemporary debates on mutual exchange, peer-to-peer learning, and the cultivation of community repertoires and repositories of knowledge, these that aren't mediated by experts or kind of truth-proclaiming authorities. Okay, so this takes me to the politics of expertise and some of the ongoing and unsettled debates over who's an expert and what forms of expertise constitute evidence for or against particular courses of action. This figure is taken from Collins and Evans' work on the different waves of science studies. And in their book, they argue that an age of authority and democracy have now been replaced by a new age of expertise, in which the critical challenge is to ascertain the boundaries between different kinds of specialists. So in the first move, it was recognised that technical decision-making couldn't solve problems in the public domain, so there was a need to extend it beyond the kind of technically qualified elite to enhance political legitimacy. But this then dissolved the boundary between expertise and the public, and it's the wave of what they call the third wave of science studies to kind of understand again and reevaluate these kinds of studies of experience and expertise and understand what that means for the citizen expert. And this kind of idea of the citizen expert has been seen as a way to address some of the challenges in policy making. through what's sometimes been called the double promise. And what they mean there is that citizen experts can help policymakers tap into novel challenges of participation or untap what some authors have called idle knowledge resources. Citizen science in deliberative systems has also been seen as a form of redress for economic injustice. But of course, it can also be really problematic to see citizens as just epistemic assets in political processes that have already been determined by those with epistemic privilege. And then at the same time, the kind of rise of this discourse and interest in the citizen expert has been conflated by some with the rise of post-truth populism and an epistemic crisis. So moving elsewhere in the literature, populist knowledge, unlike citizen science, is kind of proposed by right-wing activists to justify counter-knowledge and alternative knowledge authorities. I feel I'm getting into conspiracy stuff here, but this has been sort of discussed or referred to as developing post-truth repertoires for contesting epistemic authorities. And I think that conflation that you find across different bodies of work between citizen experts and post-truth has produced new terrains for contestation. So on the one hand, there's now scholars that are demanding a new epistocracy to reclaim and revalue more traditional forms of expertise. I'm thinking here of a book by Jason Brennan in 2016 called Against Democracy, and he's arguing that an epistocracy is needed based on the idea that policy decisions should only be in the hands of people who pass tests of political knowledge. And that's like a reaction to the Brexit and Trump and the rise of right-wing populism. And then on the other hand, of course, there's those that argue against epistocracy on the basis that disenfranchising people on the grounds of ignorance is likely to produce suboptimal decisions and, of course, also further disenfranchise those that are already disadvantaged. So I think this sort of links with a whole range of questions around what's often called evidence-based policy and the way that that's deeply politicised. It's produced in different epistemic communities, or sometimes what's called epinets, which sort of enact this epistemic closure. And exclusion from those sorts of decision-making networks is also another form of injustice, because certain groups or people are then deprived of connections to what's been called helpful epistemic peers. And just to step back into the academy for a moment, of course, all of these debates, I've kind of used the terrain of policymaking here to illustrate this, but they equally apply to higher education sector and academic institutions in terms of the ways in which disciplines and traditional epistemic communities have worked, the kinds of hierarchies that we create and perpetuate between science, social science, arts and humanities, sort of the status of expression and experience vis-a-vis evidence and expertise, the permeability of boundaries between disciplines and how institutions reinforce those in particular ways, all the ways in which the kind of academic policy power complex often works to legitimise or delegitimise particular ways of knowing. So we come full circle here, back to where I sort of started in the very first lecture, with the commodification of expertise. And I'm referring here to kind of like, or locating this in the context of a shift from industrialism to what's called informationalism, which has been heralded as a kind of new mode of production. So knowledge capitalism is now what characterises our contemporary world. The knowledge economy has actually been described as a second enclosures movement, in which we see the kind of aggressive extension of intellectual property rights to the fields of knowledge, culture and information. Traditionally, knowledge has been seen as the kind of classic example of the public good, pure public good, one that's available to all to use. You can use it and it doesn't diminish. So that would be the argument. But the commodification of expertise turns that on its head, because knowledge is the economic resource through which the marketisation of expertise, information and intelligence and data and as the basis for wealth creation and competitiveness is maintained. So this is where I'm kind of really bringing back in Kavita's lecture that we had last time, because she gave us a really fascinating insight into a lot of these issues, as well as their consequences. So for Kavita, not only is like technological theft heavily racialized, she also talked about how digital piracy was a backlash against this form of knowledge enclosure. We started discussions with Kavita about the knowledge commons and the ways in which sort of new kinds of open epistemic repositories can be created all over the place to try and put forward this idea of the knowledge commons as a challenge to the commodification of expertise. And I think there's a number of other things that are really interesting here to think about. It's like some of the work on data activism and data justice. One example is Jonathan Sinneman's work in South Africa on data activism and technopolitics. And he's kind of looking at how grassroots activists mobilise data to support their discourses and practices of spatial injustice, but how that's also an extremely fragile form of data. And he also sort of draws on Shoshana Zuboff's idea of surveillance capitalism to highlight some threats to social justice. And I'll just quote what he says here. Sociocultural misrecognition occurs when personal data are algorithmically processed and subject to categorization and political misrepresentation, which renders people democratically voiceless and able to challenge misuses of their data. So where we're landing now is around these kinds of data valences practices. And this is the last kind of body of work that I'm going to suggest we bring into the field of urban epistemics. I'm obviously not obviously, but I am much less familiar with this literature. But I think it's really important to think about artificial intelligence and computational logics that shape these kinds of epistemic debates. Building on the previous point, I came across some interesting work on how markets are being reshaped by new algorithmic technologies, representing what Gruen calls an epistemic evolution of market authority. Other scholars talk about algorithmic governance as, quote, a new style of political governance based on human-computer interaction and machine learning techniques in which citizens are to be governed as co-producers of personalized services interacting with the algorithms of database software. So that's kind of quite a apolitical statement, but the work of people like Kelly Cotter politicizes this quite deeply in terms of thinking about the black box problem or black box gaslighting. And what she means there is the kind of opacity of algorithms that result from corporate secrecy and technical complexity. So there's loads of other work we can engage with here around the implications of robotics and automation and artificial intelligence on the world of work or the world of care or service delivery, new forms of data politics, which engage with this kind of artificial turn. But also some have argued that artificial intelligence has such strong epistemological implications that it constitutes a new form of algorithmic thought. I'm not going to pretend to have fully understood or digested all of this yet, but there's a really interesting special issue of Theory, Culture and Society, edited by Beatrice Farsi, on some of these issues around the kind of post-human turn and the relations between computation and cognition. So that's my whirlwind through kind of 8 key debates that I think shape this field of urban epistemics. Certainly they're all debates which I've engaged with to a greater or lesser degree over the past 20 years and enable me to say a lot more than I do co-production. And I think these kinds of different debates give us quite a rich epistemic vocabulary to think about urban epistemics. And they work at different levels. So on the one hand, there's a set of vocabulary that helps us kind of define the thing we're looking at. So this is in blue in the diagram here. So you've kind of got epistemic governance, the epistemic turn, the epistemic order, epistemic system. There's a set of vocabularies that help us diagnose particular forms of epistemic injustice. Those are in red. There's a set of vocabularies that help us think about the determining factors which shape how people's power in epistemic interactions play out. So things to do with trust or interactions or privilege or credibility or authority or resilience. And then there's a set of sort of vocabularies, and I think these are still slightly underdeveloped, that help us direct what our attention and think about what we should be focusing on as reparatory mechanisms, and those things are in green. And I think this kind of epistemic lexicon, there's much more that is missed off this, help us sort of connect with these different kinds of debates and gives us a vocabulary to apply to our own work within urban studies. So the urban dimensions of this kind of work are often sometimes explicit, they're often implicit or invisible, sometimes absent. In a lot of the things that I've read in the last month and before, you'll find case studies of epistemic injustice about healthcare, about environment, about science, medicine, sport, academia, or then sometimes it's categorized according to group, like race or gender, but it's very rarely spatialized. And so I think these are really important conversations that are happening in disciplinary silos. There's urban dimensions to these debates, but there's also much that urban studies offer. I feel that might be the youngest readership, listenership that we have. Do you mind muting online world? I can't see anyone. It's like talking into a vacuum. So just to take us into urban studies, and I'll try and do this relatively quickly. Of course, there's much further to go, but I think urban studies is pretty active in efforts to try in certain places, certainly here amongst colleagues actually in this group of people in the room and at Sheffield more widely, in efforts to decolonise knowledge production and epistemologies within urban studies with a strong kind of experimental ethos. And I think that's reflected in ideas around Southern and Eastern urbanisms or insurgent or informal planning, or on our kinds of efforts to redraw our own epistemic communities within and beyond urban studies. I think there's some really good examples, for instance, around some of the contemporary debates on comparative urbanism. I don't know if anyone's read Michele's latest and Colin's latest book on comparative urban studies, but you know, some really interesting debates here around how we stop searching for some sort of unassailable truth of the urban and instead look for different kinds of ways of juxtaposing or aligning our ideas underpinned by a commitment to equitable partnerships and more non-extractive forms of research. I think the urban is also a site of and struggle over epistemic rights and resources. We can take the position, as some do, that urban areas have always been positioned as strategic sites in the formation of justice movements. But as I said, some of those geographical dimensions are generally under-examined. There are some notable examples. I've been starting to work with this idea. There's a piece in Environmental Science and Policy where they're looking at how they're using the idea of epistemic justice to look at nature-based solutions in different cities in Europe and Asia. And Vanessa and her colleagues have also written an article recently on how the outcomes of co-production challenge epistemic injustices and contribute to urban inequality. In relation to sort of studies on ignorance, there's one chapter I came across by Scott Frickle and Abby Kinchy who look at the geographical dimensions of ignorance. They identify 3 particular spatial dimensions to this work. So there's like ignorance by exclusion, which is where some places simply don't have knowledge produced about them. There's sort of the way in which scalar narratives and cognitive schemas constrain or enable different ways of seeing, thinking and acting. So this kind of draws on the idea that scale itself recasts what is seen as being true knowledge. So scale is an epistemology itself. And then there's the way that kind of some spatial data ignorance is organized through spatial data that exists or doesn't exist. And I was just thinking of the example of the Sustainable Development Goals, for instance. So in some earlier work I did, we looked at sort of the availability of local data indicators and how sort of ideas and concepts of informal settlement, slums or insecure housing did or didn't apply in different contexts. And I think you can really get this sense that there is a sort of spatial ignorance there that is having very dramatic effects. I think we also see how the urban provides this kind of structuration of relations and institutions and shapes the possibility of democratic epistemic interactions. Planning is a good example here, for instance, in relation to some of the work on post-political spatial development. There's a couple of really interesting papers in Aïcha and Economy and Space at the moment on densification and the kind of what they call the socio-material epistemics of urban densification. But I think more broadly, planning scholars are really good at drawing attention to the way in which citizen organisations in planning can end up embracing quite rationalistic or bureaucratic formal instruments of knowledge and become technical entities in their own right. You know, lots of us are concerned with these kinds of questions of capture and co-optation. So I think there's something really interesting there that we can do more work on around the kinds of epistemic openings and closures in urban policymaking processes and governance structures. Briefly, I hope, I think, you know, obviously we also see how urban education and pedagogy is a kind of strategy for challenging these forms of epistemic domination and oppression. It's not obviously exclusively the case, but when people talk of the marginalised or the oppressed, these evocations are often grounded in urbanising or low-income urban areas, informal settlements, or within what Malik calls the surrounds. You've got the work of people like Jane Addams and her work who founded Whole House Settlement in the west side of Chicago. You've got contemporary examples in the Black supplementary schools movement. For instance, you know, Malik and I have been starting to develop a relationship with a Black supplementary school in Moss Side and Hume in Manchester called Rekindle, and they're kind of leading the own way in providing critical education and consciousness raising for young people in those areas. So cities are kind of seen as critical learning systems. Colin McFarlane, a colleague of the UI, is not alone in encouraging us as urban scholars to recuperate learning as a political and practical act. I think Planning also provides another good example of this politicisation of expertise in terms of how policy processes and political institutions validate, exclude or marginalise particular forms of expertise. There's lots of examples which I'll skip over now, including like a special issue of our colleague Anora Robin and Michele Lancione in urban geography on the politics of urban expertise. The SDGs is another really good example of this kind of politicisation of knowledge and evidence. And finally, we can say in many ways that the urban age of experts began long ago, as these kinds of questions of the appropriate scale, nature and purpose of economic development were increasingly shaped by this so-called knowledge economy. But this expertise industry really soared after the 2000s with a proliferation of strategies to build science cities or smart cities or knowledge capitals or silicon alleys or silicon savannas or silicon glens or whatever they might be, peddled by experts touting their wares across the world. So the extent to which cities can be smart is then the basis for competitive success. There's a lot of different literature on this, as I'm sure many of you are really aware of, critical and otherwise, about smart cities and the kinds of forms of intelligence that are produced through the digitisation, datafication and automation of intelligence. And I think smart cities as a kind of terrain for our investigation cuts across both the politics and the commodification of expertise. There's a number of different elements of that, like whether it's about big data or urban analytics or the kind of rise of dashboard and indicator projects. But these kinds of smart discourses give rise to new regimes of spatial data. Igor Kavita has sort of written a paper on algorithmic nations. I think to a certain extent we're seeing algorithmic cities, or at least we need to ask ourselves whether we are, and the ways in which these can be seen as city regional and techno-political conceptual assemblages. And of course, a lot of this comes back to what does it mean to know? What does human intelligence look like? And how do these kinds of smart spaces challenge our understanding of the humanness of intelligence? So that's my conversation starter for urban epistemics, drawing together those kinds of epistemic debates. For me, it helps me develop a much more coherent narrative of what I've been trying to do over the last 20 years as a golden thread through my work. I'm really interested to hear what you all think about it. I know that there are things missing. For instance, the study of language and linguistics, I didn't have time to get into that, but there's loads of really interesting stuff about the way in which our speech utterances perform acts of epistemic exclusion themselves. I know we've got Khrushchev in the room, and so it's made me think about theology and religion as other areas we need to engage with. So I think the task is to reframe, reveal, repair and reimagine how we can understand epistemic issues, with whom and what we do about them. This means I suggest asking the following questions. What are the epistemic dimensions of contemporary urban theory, policy and practice? How do structures, systems and regimes reproduce urban epistemic domination and injustice? What can be done to make reparations through the transformation of epistemic relations of power and privilege? And how can we reimagine existing and forge new epistemic imaginaries and forms of collective intelligence? So for me, that move helps me position co-production within the field of urban epistemics. That's one of the things I said we're trying to do in this lecture series. Now I think we can rethink co-production as a new epistemology in praxis, requiring and embracing different forms of ignorance. It can be a process for enhancing democratic epistemic interactions. It might be an entry point for the reform of academic institutions and our knowledge-making and validating practices. It could be a strategy for producing critical consciousness and enabling learning within context of everyday life, etc. It could not be any of those things, because obviously it too is prone to capture and reinterpretation. And I think it also helps us think slightly differently, or in a more integrated way, about the work of us at the Urban Institute. I was quite inspired by the work that Malik led us on to develop this prospectus around urban inhabitation and the urban technical, which has helped me reshape some of these ideas. And I hope that this kind of narration of urban epistemics helps feed into that as well. I think it connects a lot of different aspects of what we're looking at in the Urban Institute together, where you wouldn't otherwise have seen connections. You know, for instance, Aidan and Simon's new project on robotics, Malik's work on Black urbanism, in the LOACT project, looking at these kind of spatialized knowledge gaps in what constitutes local action on climate change in ordinary cities, which, you know, perhaps that's a particular kind of commitment to overcoming spatial ignorance. And it also helps us have different interdisciplinary conversations, you know, connecting with work like Kavita, who we heard from last time. And next year we've got Jennifer Gabrice and Luciana Parisi coming to talk to the Urban Institute, and you're all welcome to come, about their particular work. which we would never have thought about if we were just looking for people who did co-production, but we can definitely engage with if we're thinking about urban epistemics. So thank you. I'm really interested to hear what my three colleagues have to say in response to this. We've asked them to talk about these three questions. What work might urban epistemics do within and beyond urban studies? What might be revealed or foregrounded? How do these epistemic influences connect to your own work? Or how does your work contribute to understanding urban epistemics and vice versa? And what critical concepts, questions, or topics shape the future of urban epistemics? And these are the same questions that we will come back to discuss on our tables after we've heard from our respondents. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Beth. So all through the lecture, I was thinking what is it, 30 years ago, the great bell hooks told us how to deconstruct the classroom to learn and teach to transgress. And I was wondering, Beth, if you were doing something similar, deconstruct our spaces of learning in the urban environment, but in the digital age, right? So it's a kind of new challenges and new views. I was really inspired by your lecture. Thank you. And I know you all have many questions, and we'll have like almost a whole hour to discuss them collectively. But first, we are going to have three responses from Michele, Linda, and Aïcha. So first, Michele, it's my great pleasure to introduce Michele, who is Professor of Economic and Political Geography at the Polytechnic of Turin. He's also a visiting professor at the Urban Institute, where he's always welcome. And also he directs the Beyond Inhabitation Lab. So if you haven't heard about it, I do recommend you Google Beyond Inhabitation Lab, and you're going to talk about it, I guess, and find a lot of the exciting work that he's doing since he got his own European Research Council grant. Thank you, Michele.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Beth, for having me. It was a great talk. Okay. So I'm trying to tackle some of the questions that Beth posed on the last slide, talking about housing and homelessness. And so I'm asking you to take the house, to consider the house with its walls and infrastructures of provision, with its cement and its architectural and engineering calculations, with its caresses, the bags with groceries, runaways and hidings, with its being a nodal point in networks where resources are rendered marketable after their ecological extraction, and in doing so, these resources are then turned to function as channels to further user structure and value generation. With its mirrors made of sand, its crackers and pillows, its modes of reproduction, metabolic function and distribution of emotional and material labor, gendered economies. Take the house not as the expression of these intricate ongoing assemblages, but as the ongoing itself, as the constant permutation, the ritornello with the maintenance, repair, and shifts needed to keep it going. The house, so to speak, as an intersection. In such a view, the notion of how to acquire knowledge on the functioning of this specific machine of machines becomes a matter of epistemic stances. It is, first of all, a problem of epistemology and then of methodology. It is a problem of how the question is asked more than the kind of question one asks. Because again, one can inquire about electricity, for instance, as the finite point where offer and demand meets, or can inquire about electricity as the strata where human-nature relationships comes to be defined as collective subjects or arrangements within the rule book of contemporary capitalism. One can inquire about household violence as the effect of intimate deranged geometries of behaviors, or it can be read as the access point to long-term cultural formations, the ways in which the triad of sex, gender, and sexuality is made to work within the house to serve a wider economy of societal needs. The house, so to speak, can be asked as an epistemic question, as a form or as a process. The question of the house, to say it otherwise, can be posed as a problem in need of a fix or as one of inhabitation. The former is how things have been dealt with in the academic and the policy-oriented knowledge production around housing and homing, as well and its other, homelessness. What I'm positing is not just the problem of how housing knowledge is servant to market dynamics, or to use Beth's helpful analytic, a problem of the politics of expertise and the commodification of the epistemic. Of course, both are part of the issue, as many have indicated. But there is also something deeper going on. I would perhaps propose a further analytic to the ones that Beth proposed, and it's a question of segmentation. The term segmentation comes from marketing studies and refers to the ways in which a market of potential customers is divided into groups based on characteristics that are defined from above. Take the homeless. In policy aimed at them, the homeless are often referred as the client of the service. They are segmented or user of a series of resources, including, of course, carceral resources. In scholarship, they are identified as a question in need of an answer, as subjectivities in need of being addressed. And in both cases, the immanence of life needs to be segmented into parts in order to produce the homeless as the raw matter one can work with. The residue of this process, that which exceeds segmentation, that which is expelled in order to retain something workable, becomes just a series of inarticulate and unnameable desires, overflows of matter and substance that cannot be contained, explained, or narrated in ways that easily fit within the urge of policy and scholarship to describe, to prescribe, and to illustrate. Segmentation, in a sense, is the founding act of a form of epistemic violence constructed around specific principles. We, the bearers of knowledge and technique, are confronted with a world of social facts that require our intervention and attention. The challenge here is not to trace how things are processually formed, but to find ways to contain given formations within increasingly elaborate categories and modes of calculation. The obsession of quantifying homelessness is an example of this. In this highly medicalized field, the homeless are segmented in order to be fit in a manner that evolves ever more refined forms of subcategorization and specialization. The basic idea underpinning the relationship between segmentation and the academic is that if scholarship gets better at counting, naming, identifying, recollecting, and comparing, then it can better inform policy. And it can become better at solving the issue at stake. So defining homelessness in order to be able to work with it. Nothing more and nothing less than a violent parcelization of life. For example, the following text shows how leading scholars of homelessness across the Atlantic, US, UK, and continental Europe, are scholars that are working with their national governments, all of them, are proposing to develop a global framework for conceptualizing and measuring homelessness. Now, who's who and what is expelled in order to extract what can be contained in such powerful framings. These fragments of life are what we can extract as the homeless after having expelled all the rest. Now, as a scholar confronted with this and deploying the most refined critical grammar at my disposal, I can only ask, what the fuck is going on here? Who the fuck is this? Here we are confronted with people living into tents, cheap hotels, streets, temporary accommodation, cars, but never with people within and off. Here we are confronted with a series of spotlights on specific points of a vast region in a move that renders the view of the overall cartography not only impossible, which is again the right problem of the epistemological exclusion highlighted by that, but also unnecessary. Segmentation works not simply by creating forms of epistemic injustice, since we are not asked to know what we don't want to know, namely whatever exceeds the acts of sleeping in a car, but it works as an effective and conceptual engine charting a terrain, a desire, canvassing a specific geographical imagination. That in turn defines the meaning of being of knowledge and the possibility of being political. Imagine instead the house and its other intersections, the house and its others as the ritornello of inhabitation cutting through segmentation, as the transversal space, to take from Malik, that is made and unmade within and beyond capture. Segmenting, this is my point, is a form of epistemic capturing, the creation of another through expulsion, from which the extraction of effective cultural, political, economic value can be accommodated. So what I am doing here is not to reduce the intensities of homelessness to a mere epistemological problem. Individuals do sleep in cars. They do get evicted. They do get beaten at home. Questioning how these experiences are captured is not about avoiding a confrontation with those experiences, but rather to ask for a radical emplacement in their histories and intersectional makings. It is to address the epistemology colonizing those experiences in order to unravel the propositional politics that lies in the life that has been segmented out. And here I'm concluding. Escaping the violence of segmentation in urban studies is a difficult and perilous task. It requires the task of ridiculing the available grammars, but also method to speak back to power. Here, I think the recent intervention of Catherine McCready to be driven by wonder is key. Fighting the violence of epistemic segmentation requires, to quote her, a method that demands openness and is unsatisfied with questions that result in descriptive, data-induced answers. Such a move requires a form of creativity grounded in an intensification of our understanding of violence. It does not ask where people sleep in order to identify an issue, but it traces altogether and always at the same time what are the financialized, heteronormative, racialized, and legal histories that are embodied in and give rise to dispossessed homeless life. The question shifts away from being one of housing studies to become one of housing justice, where the latter, to follow Ananya Roy and Raquel Rolnick, among others, is about how justice is conceptualized in emplacement. What is just vis-a-vis situated histories of dispossession, not in a general canon where epistemic injustice has taken place for too long. So I believe that what Beth is providing us is an invitation with much insight to tackle these kind of questions in urban studies and their methodological implication, looking for new grammars and new ways of framing the problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Michele. Wonderful intervention. So now I'm going to introduce our colleague, Linda Westman, who is a research fellow at the Urban Institute and also has an excellent record in thinking about the role of knowledge in climate change politics. So, thank you, Linda.
Thank you. And thank you, first of all, Beth, for that wonderful presentation, and to Michele as well. That was beautiful. And thank you for inviting me to contribute to this discussion. So I want to share 3 sets of reflections that are inspired by the lecture. And the first point is perhaps rather obvious, but I decided to make it anyway, just for something that you want to continue saying every time you have a chance to. Beth pointed out in her first talk of the series that a key premise for co-production is the refusal to bracket how we do our work. And this obviously recognizes how academia is embedded in systems of inequality that we need to address to deliver epistemic justice. At the same time, our day-to-day work involves the generation of knowledge that tends to fit prevailing norms of science. So, for example, producing high-impact publications and proposals that match the requirements of funders is absolutely integral to our work. These also happen to be activities that lend themselves very easily to the reproduction of epistemic hierarchies. So it implies, for example, situating our work in relation to recognized debates and scholarship, even though we often know that these practices of citations that are implied in that tend to cement patriarchal and racial legacies. And ECRs that are operating in precarious short-term positions are under particular pressure to deliver this kind of outputs because they're basically essential to their employment. So in that context, it's very easy to become complicit with structures of knowledge and power in academia, and a lot more difficult to challenge them. So the question here is to what extent universities, as centers of consolidated epistemic authority, are actually suited to be leading the agenda on epistemic justice. This brings me to my second point, which relates to risks of reproducing epistemic power even whilst we're trying to address it. So I read De Sousa Santos' Epistemologies of the South a few years ago. I was incredibly inspired by that work, but also immediately afterwards very troubled by what that might mean for our research. And I became obsessed with trying to understand what are the actual practices that support the flourishing of multiple epistemologies in the context of doing academic work. It was very difficult to find answers to that. Yes, we can find inspiration in decolonial scholarship, but it seemed rather easier to find cautionary tales. So for instance, in climate policy, which is my area of work, we have recently witnessed a rise of interest in indigenous knowledge. This has become the new sexy topic that tends to represent an alternative to business as usual practices in the face of global ecological breakdown. And of course, recognizing indigenous knowledge can imply supporting the self-determination and rights of indigenous peoples. But what we also see in climate debates is the appropriation of indigenous forms of knowing and its translation into dominant discourses of science. And that is, of course, an extraction that clearly repeats rather than challenges colonial violence. So me and Vanessa have tried to reflect on this kind of contradiction through a concept that we call IV discourses, which seems to me to represent the diametric opposite of what Beth described to us as willful hermeneutical ignorance. So what we describe as an enthusiasm among researchers, including ourselves, that come across radical subaltern ideas to engage with them rather than ignore them. So we wish to contribute to their elaboration, but when we do so, we begin to align that idea with our own definitions, with our concepts, with our vocabulary, and the more popular we make that concept, the more heavily the weights of opposing hegemonic projects actually become imposed on that idea. And like a living organism choked by the ivy, this idea then actually becomes buried by a sort of conceptual overgrowth that makes it die or disappear in the end. So again, my point is that academia actually is very, very good at regenerating rather than challenging epistemic imbalances. Finally, I want to raise some reflections that might emerge from bringing urban epistemics research to China, which also is my own area where a lot of my work has been focused on. The first question in that context is, what defines epistemic justice? Could we easily agree on a definition of what it even means? Beth's presentation provided several principles that could serve as a foundation here. So for example, epistemological exclusion infers that downplaying the experiences of certain groups is unjust. And that is something that we could probably quite easily intuitively agree to. And the application of that approach in China seems both obvious and highly relevant. For example, it could capture the invalidation of claims by the media or communities and the politics of building their rights as knowledge holders. But on the other hand, we cannot just assume that the concept of epistemic justice could travel around in that kind of straightforward fashion. To begin with, there is no single word for justice in Mandarin. The exact translation implies a whole set of different meanings related to morality, right and wrong, legitimacy, all linked with distinct philosophical foundations. And actually, the translation of unjust and injustice translates into an entirely different set of meaning related to responsibilities and rights in relation to states, for example. As indigenous, feminist, and decolonial scholars have all argued, the recognition of diverse forms of oppression and resistance implies that we need to refuse any sort of universal definition of justice. And this suggests that epistemic injustice might in fact appear in a whole bunch of different kind of guises in China, but also elsewhere, and that we can never assume to just know it when we see it. A second question is, what kind of practices could produce epistemic justice in China? So the literature on co-production, but also the politics of expertise, as well as democratic epistemic interactions that Beth raised just now, indicates the possibility of building epistemic justice by inviting underrepresented communities to build knowledge. And often we're assuming here some sort of participatory process that would reflect democratic principles. Of course, this becomes highly problematic in the political system of China, which was never designed to be participative in that sense. We can guess that this approach is unlikely to ever become particularly popular there, but also that it might never align with ideological orientations. So if the absence of participation is not itself evidence of injustice, we're probably going to have to adjust our empirical focus and ask different questions. Look instead, for example, for mechanisms to make experience translate into knowledge in the absence of overt participation, which raises a whole bunch of different questions. In addition, ideas on participation imply that society is ordered into discrete groups that can interact with each other in the first place to produce knowledge. As me and my colleague Ping Huang have recently argued, this idea is itself a social construction that tends to break down in analysis in China. So for example, if the state is part of corporate structures and academia is part of the state, neither can freely interact with the other to produce knowledge. So we have tried to adopt another point of entry to understand social interaction, which is inspired by the correlative epistemology. Let's say it many more times. This is a worldview in Chinese philosophy that describes reality as constituted by webs of relations and social life as ruled by complex ethical standards of guanxi networks. So one implication here is that organizations already exist as part of pre-existing relationships, and that their rules of interactions, which are following guanxi rules, dictate what forms of knowledge can be built. Which again would direct us to an entirely new set of questions on how epistemic justice is constructed, by whom and how it is valued, and so forth. If urban epistemics is a field that we can define through our work, I hope that we can shape it by asking that kind of questions, and I would be excited to be part of that conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Linda. And is there an epistemic injustice in an intelligent building that seems to know better than us what our thermal comfort is? I'm really freezing. Anyway, to finish the interventions, it's my pleasure to introduce Aïcha Diallo, who is a curator, educator, and editor. And we also have the privilege to have her as a PhD candidate in the context of emerging urban inequalities here at the University of Sheffield. Aïcha, the work of Aïcha focuses on Black geographies, communal trauma, and reparative practices in Berlin and Dakar. So Aïcha, I can see you. I'm sorry. Did you? The picture? I have this. Did you send it to me?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Beth, for the invitation. It was a great lecture, very compelling, and you're giving us the opportunity to reflect deeply on the intersections of urbanism, knowledge production, and power relations. Thank you, Michele and Linda, for your amazing responses. I'm really inspired by that, and I hope I can also bring in also my perspective and bring new ideas maybe. So in my response, I would like to focus on two main concepts stemming from Beth's lecture. The first one being the meaning of epistemological exclusion, and the second being the pedagogy of the oppressed. Many areas of our lives, from the visual identities of large cities, including architecture and museums, the processes of production and consumption, as well as schools and universities, are permeated by colonial continuities. With this in mind, I'm very much interested in looking into the submerged layers of urban spaces in our post-colonial moment. In my work, I ask how Black cultural infrastructures challenge the neo-colonial matrix of power by embracing their own set of realities, histories, and aesthetics. So the idea of urban epistemics plays a crucial role. So I find it interesting to look at the combining of the two words, even though I have a hard time pronouncing epistemological exclusion. So asking the question, who is excluded, who is pushed away from the acquisition of knowledge? The artist and theorist Grada Quilomba argues that it is necessary to first deconstruct hegemonic knowledge production in order to activate a process of unlearning. I quote, "The dominant system of knowledge production determines which questions merit to be questioned. From which perspective do you analyze them, and how do we explain them? what is considered to be the absolute truth, and in whom to believe and to trust. Who can speak? Who can ask questions? Who can talk? And how to look at questions. Who knows what? And who doesn't know? What is a knowledge as knowledge? And what is not? End of quote. According to Kavita Philip, institutions, as also the academic ones, reproduce the hegemony of knowledge production, which is governed by colonial, capitalist, patriarchal system. And she also argues that it is only if marginalized people, if marginalized people come to bring their own perspectives, a new configuration of power and knowledge is made possible. In this respect, it's also important to look at the concept of epistemicide, which was introduced by sociologist Bonaventura de Souza, and he actually talks about the erasure and the destruction of pre-colonial knowledge. So actually the destructive force of it, and which actually is also the base of our post-colonial moment. Teju Cole, the writer of Open City, while giving a lecture titled City as Palimpsest, he says, I quote, "A palimpsest is a surface which is used for repeated writing. With time, what you rub off does not rub off completely. It comes back to haunt you. So the overlay of knowledge and memories are written and rewritten on our urban surfaces. Therefore, I chose an image that I'm going to send it, an image of an artistic intervention titled From Negative Space to Spaces of Resistance, which was created by the Berlin-based platform Decoloniale. This project uses different forms and tools of knowledge production to confront Germany's colonial amnesia. Now, what I'd like to focus on, the second point, is the pedagogy of the oppressed. As we know, university is a social system. I have to think of the production of space that was coined by the philosopher Henri Lefebvre. People and their social practices define the space in which they exist and act. Spaces can be experienced differently by different social groups. In this way, urban spaces and institutions like the university can have a bearing on mechanism of inclusion and exclusion. This is also expressed through that which is not revealed, spoken, or conveyed. That's why the idea of the pedagogy of the oppressed you propose, Beth, is really compelling. How can we learn from each other and with each other? What collective strategies can we develop that inspires us to think and act in solidarity? So using the idea of engaged pedagogy, the cultural theorist Bell Hooks examines how educational contexts can be transformed into creative, self-reflective sites of learning and unlearning. Hooks challenges us to form alliances and reposition ourselves within this context. Last but not least, I would like to end my response with the following questions as open questions to expand on the idea of urban epistemics. So what happens to the performativity of knowledge production when it's transferred from here to the urban lives and spaces? Also, with the idea of our post-colonial moment, how do we go beyond binary categories? Because usually what happens that this is being reproduced. So if we talk, for example, of epistemic justice versus epistemic injustice. So how can we go and see the in-between spaces? Also following Abdul Malik Simon's concept of the surrounds and beyond capture, how do we acknowledge and at the same time build alliances with the unseen in order to avoid doing further harm? Because I also believe that by excluding or by appropriating knowledge, there is a sense of destruction in place. So how do we avoid doing further harm? By following capitalist logics and the predictable processes of cooptation. And finally, also the idea of bodies, the merging of bodies and space. So what about embodied knowledge that is not always tangible? And so art and the use of imagination, how do we take this into consideration? Thank you so much.